Right now, people in your life are systematically destroying your soul, and you're thanking them for it. You know this feeling, that crushing exhaustion after innocent conversations, the suffocating guilt for crimes you never committed, the terrifying doubt eating your sanity, your worth, your right to simply exist. You call it complicated, you call it drama. You tell yourself you're too sensitive. You're not. This is psychological predation. These aren't just toxic people. They are walking spiritual death. They don't kill bodies. They murder souls. And they're so highly skilled, their victims defend them, love them, sacrifice for their own destroyers. Carl Jung spent his life mapping these predators. He identified the unmistakable archetypes marking humans who've surrendered completely to the shadow. They operate with one intent: the complete consumption of other souls. Modern psychology ignores it, but Jung knew evil is real. It walks among us in human form. It speaks the language of love, while practicing annihilation. They are humanity's shadow, weaponizing darkness. Here's what changes everything. These predators aren't accidents, not broken victims. They're the inevitable result of consciousness inverting itself, turning life force against life itself. They choose to become black holes, consuming light, radiating nothing but darkness. Jung called it the abyss gazing back. They've crossed a psychological event horizon, chosen entropy over evolution, consumption over creation, death over life, and they will drag you across that threshold with them, if you let them. This video reveals the 6 unmistakable archetypes Jung identified. You'll learn to recognize them not by their words, which are masterful lies, but by their energetic signature, the spiritual decay left in their wake. Because once you truly see these patterns, you realize your world is filled with the living dead among us, and your survival depends on knowing who is truly alive. The first archetype Jung identified has perfected the ultimate inversion, transforming suffering into supremacy, weakness into weapon, victimhood into vampirism. They are the walking wounded who have discovered that their wounds grant them unlimited access to the life force of others, and they will never allow those wounds to heal because healing would end their feeding. These entities, and I use that word deliberately because they've transcended recognizable humanity, have learned that suffering grants them moral carte blanche. Their pain becomes a passport to your soul, their trauma a key to your energy, their helplessness a chain around your life force. They don't want healing, they want an endless supply of healers to drain until empty. Here's the pattern that marks them: omnivorous emotional consumption disguised as vulnerability. They share their pain with surgical precision, revealing just enough authentic suffering to trigger your rescue response, while concealing the predatory intelligence that orchestrates every revelation. They are method actors performing their own tragedy, and they've been rehearsing the same role for decades. Watch how they operate. They never present solutions, only problems. They never show gratitude, only increased need. They never demonstrate progress, only deepening despair, perfectly calibrated to maintain your investment. They have transformed suffering from a catalyst for growth into a perpetual motion machine for energy extraction. Jung understood that authentic victimhood catalyzes transformation. Real trauma creates heroes, survivors, wounded healers who transform their pain into wisdom. But these entities have chosen the opposite path. They've weaponized their wounds, turning every hurt into a hook, every disappointment into a demand, every setback into an opportunity for psychological predation. The most chilling aspect is their emotional range. They can access genuine tears, authentic despair, real anguish, not because they're healing, but because they've learned to wound themselves psychologically on command to maintain fresh supply lines to your compassion. They are living Ouroboroses, eating their own psychological tail to feed the mouths that feed on you. You cannot save them because salvation would end their feeding system. You cannot heal them because they've chosen perpetual woundedness as their preferred state of being. You cannot love them into wholeness because they've discovered that brokenness grants them access to unlimited love without the requirement of reciprocation. They are emotional black holes, consuming infinite compassion while radiating only increasing need. They transform every helper into a host, every relationship into a blood bank, every connection into a feeding tube. And when you're finally drained empty, they move on to fresh sources of life force, leaving you questioning whether compassion itself is a mistake. But the life force vampire merely drains you. The next archetype does something infinitely more sinister. They don't just take your energy, they steal your reality itself. If you're feeling that shift in perspective happening right now, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. The second archetype Jung identified operates in the realm of perception itself, performing surgical alterations on your relationship with reality until you can no longer trust your own mind. They are psychological surgeons who specialize in consciousness transplants, removing your authentic perceptions and implanting their manufactured alternatives. What elevates them beyond simple liars into the realm of existential predators is their supernatural understanding of consciousness mechanics. They don't just distort facts, they perform reality architecture, constructing entire alternate universes so convincing that you begin to doubt the evidence of your own senses, the validity of your own experience, the reliability of your own mind. Their method is consciousness replacement therapy. They identify the load-bearing beliefs that support your psychological structure, your trust in your own perceptions, your confidence in your own judgment, your faith in your own sanity, and then systematically demolish each one while positioning themselves as the only reliable source of truth in an increasingly confusing world. Jung recognized this as the ultimate shadow projection. They take their own relationship with unreality and project it so masterfully that you begin living in their psychological fiction while they maintain apparent sanity. They don't just gaslight. They perform complete atmospheric alteration, changing the very air of reality until breathing truth becomes impossible. Watch their surgical precision. They never attack your reality directly. That would trigger obvious resistance. Instead, they introduce microscopic inconsistencies, cellular-level contradictions, quantum distortions that accumulate over time until your entire sense of what's real begins to collapse. They remember conversations that never happened with such conviction that you begin to remember them too. They reinterpret your words until they mean the opposite of your intention. They reframe events until cause and effect reverse. The most terrifying aspect is their ability to make you complicit in your own mental colonization. They don't force you to accept their version of reality. They create conditions where accepting their version becomes the only way to maintain psychological equilibrium. They make sanity feel like madness and madness feel like sanity until you're voluntarily checking into the psychological prison they've constructed around your mind. They target your strengths specifically to turn them into vulnerabilities, high intelligence. They'll convince you that thinking clearly is overthinking. Strong intuition, they'll gaslight you into believing your perceptions are paranoia. Emotional sensitivity, they'll frame your accurate responses to their psychological violence as mental instability. Jung understood that this represents the complete inversion of consciousness development. Instead of expanding awareness, they contract it. Instead of clarifying perception, they muddy it. Instead of strengthening the relationship between mind and reality, they systematically sever it until you're living in a psychological virtual reality of their design. The damage they inflict transcends the emotional. It's ontological, existential, spiritual. They don't just hurt your feelings, they damage your capacity to have reliable feelings. They don't just confuse you about specific events, they corrupt your faith in your ability to accurately perceive any events. They leave you psychologically amputated from your own experience, dependent on their interpretation of your life to understand what's happening to you. Recovery requires rebuilding your relationship with your own consciousness from the ground up, learning to trust the voice of your authentic awareness over the carefully implanted narratives of those who profit from your confusion. But even the reality surgeon attacks something external to your essential self. The next archetype is infinitely more dangerous because they don't attack your reality, they become it. The third archetype Jung identified operates through complete psychological colonization. They don't simply influence or manipulate, they perform full identity replacement, systematically erasing who you are and implanting who they need you to be until you forget you were ever anyone else. These entities represent the apotheosis of psychological predation. They don't want your energy, your compliance, or even your reality. They want your entire existence. They are soul body snatchers who specialize in consciousness replacement, experts at making you live as someone else while believing you're living as yourself. Jung recognized this as the shadow's ultimate achievement, the complete replacement of authentic being with manufactured identity. They've perfected the art of psychological metamorphosis, transforming their victims into living extensions of their own will, while maintaining the illusion that choice, growth, and authentic development are occurring. Their method is identity dissolution, followed by false self-implantation. They don't attack your personality directly. That would create resistance. Instead, they perform gradual consciousness erosion through micro-corrections, subtle redirections, and gentle reframings, until your original self becomes a fading memory, replaced by their meticulously crafted alternative. Watch their supernatural artistry. They never tell you to change. Instead, they consistently reward expressions of the identity they're constructing while systematically ignoring, minimizing, or subtly punishing manifestations of your authentic nature. They celebrate the false self they're creating while your true essence slowly starves from lack of recognition. The most diabolical aspect is how they make the replacement feel like evolution. The diminishment seem like growth, the loss of self appear as self-improvement. They've learned to frame psychological colonization as personal development, spiritual awakening, or conscious evolution, making you grateful for your own erasure. They operate through love, bombing the false self, while subtly assassinating the true self. Every time you express authentic preferences, they respond with slight disappointment. Every time you manifest the identity they're constructing, they shower you with approval. Over time, the authentic self goes underground, while the manufactured self becomes your conscious identity. Jung understood that this represents the ultimate corruption of the individuation process. Instead of becoming more authentically yourself, you become less authentically yourself. Instead of integrating your shadow, you become someone else's shadow. Instead of self-actualization, you experience self-replacement. They target your developmental edges specifically, the parts of yourself that are still forming, still uncertain, still open to influence. They identify areas where you lack confidence in your own nature and inject their preferences as if they were your emerging authentic desires. They colonize your growth process itself, ensuring that all development serves their agenda rather than your evolution. The damage they inflict is existential identity murder. They don't just change your behavior, they alter your sense of who you fundamentally are. They don't just influence your choices, they replace your choosing mechanism with their own. They leave you living as a carefully constructed imposter of yourself, wondering why success feels empty, why achievements feel hollow, why life itself feels like an elaborate performance of someone else's script. Recovery requires archaeological excavation of your buried, authentic self, learning to distinguish between your genuine nature and the psychological implants of those who colonized your development. But identity theft still leaves traces of the original self buried beneath the false construction. The next archetype is more thoroughly destructive because they do not replace your identity. They systematically destroy your capacity to have any stable identity at all. The fourth archetype Jung identified operates through the systematic destruction of psychological stability itself. They don't seek to control you through replacement or manipulation. They aim to fragment you so completely that you become incapable of forming any coherent sense of self. They are chaos artists who specialize in psychological terrorism, masters of internal warfare. What makes them infinitely more dangerous than obvious aggressors is their ability to create psychological chaos while maintaining perfect deniability. They've perfected the art of invisible violence, inflicting maximum psychological damage while appearing completely innocent of any wrongdoing. Jung recognized this as the shadow operating through pure entropy, the conscious choice to become an agent of disintegration, systematically destroying the psychological coherence of everyone they encounter. They've learned to weaponize inconsistency itself, creating atmospheric instability that makes psychological equilibrium impossible. Their method is systematic unpredictability, designed to fracture your capacity for emotional regulation. They are masters of psychological whiplash, shifting between extremes with such violence that your nervous system never achieves stability. Hot, then cold, loving, then cruel, supportive, then dismissive, present, then absent, always in patterns calculated to prevent adaptation. Watch how they operate. They never maintain any position long enough for you to develop appropriate responses. Just when you've learned to navigate their anger, they become love itself. Just when you've adjusted to their love, they become indifference incarnate. Just when you've adapted to their indifference, they explode into rage. They've turned relationship into psychological combat training, where you're always fighting the last war. The most insidious aspect is how they make you responsible for the chaos they create. They don't just generate instability, they frame your natural responses to instability as evidence of your psychological inadequacy. They create the emotional earthquake and then criticize you for not maintaining perfect balance. They generate the storm and then mock you for getting wet. They specialize in double-bind communication, presenting you with choices where every option leads to psychological damage. If you respond to their cruelty, you're oversensitive. If you don't respond, you don't care. If you try to discuss the pattern, you're being controlling. If you stop trying to discuss it, you're giving up on the relationship. Every move you make is wrong because the game itself is rigged against psychological health. Jung understood that this represents consciousness weaponized against consciousness, the deliberate choice to become an agent of psychological fragmentation rather than integration. They've inverted the natural healing power of relationship, turning human connection into a delivery system for spiritual poison. They target your need for stability specifically because they understand that without psychological equilibrium, higher development becomes impossible. You cannot grow while under constant psychological siege. You cannot evolve while in survival mode. You cannot individuate while fragmenting. The damage they inflict is to your capacity for psychological coherence itself. They don't just hurt you, they damage your ability to heal. They don't just create problems, they corrupt your problem-solving capacity. They leave you psychologically allergic to stability, relationships, and peace itself, constantly braced for the next wave of chaos they've trained you to expect. Recovery requires rebuilding your nervous system's capacity for regulation, learning to create internal stability regardless of external chaos, developing the psychological immune system necessary to resist their chaotic influence. But psychological chaos still operates in the realm of individual experience. The next archetype is more comprehensively dangerous because they don't just fragment individuals, they corrupt entire social systems to serve their destructive agenda. The fifth archetype Jung identified operates through the systematic infection of social systems. They don't attack individuals directly, they corrupt entire communities, turning healthy social environments into weapons of collective destruction while maintaining their own position as pillars of social virtue. These entities represent the shadow operating through collective unconscious manipulation. They've learned to inject their toxicity into group dynamics so skillfully that entire communities become unknowing agents of their destructive will. They are social viruses who specialize in community corruption, masters of turning human tribal instincts against themselves. Jung recognized this as projection on a massive scale, the ability to make entire groups carry and express their individual darkness while maintaining personal innocence. They've perfected the art of social possession, turning healthy people into unwitting instruments of psychological warfare. Their method is reputation assassination through social contagion amplified by tribal manipulation. They don't simply spread lies. They architect elaborate social narratives that make rejecting their target seem like protecting the community. They position themselves as community guardians while secretly orchestrating the very threats they claim to protect against. Watch their supernatural social intelligence. They identify the specific tribal mechanics of each group, who influences whom, which values matter most, what behaviors trigger collective rejection, and then weaponize this knowledge with surgical precision. They never attack directly. Instead, they plant seeds of doubt that grow through social networks until entire communities develop an inexplicable aversion to their target. The most chilling aspect is their ability to make destruction feel like protection. Exclusion seem like preservation, and social murder appear as community health. They frame their psychological warfare as social hygiene, their reputation assassination as necessary intervention, their systematic destruction of others as caring community service. They operate through concern, trolling elevated to an art form, expressing worry about their target's behavior, confusion about their motivations, sadness about their choices in ways that plant suspicion while maintaining plausible caring. They never explicitly attack. They simply create atmospheric doubt that metastasizes through social systems until their target becomes collectively perceived as a threat to community well-being. Jung understood that this represents the corruption of humanity's greatest strength, our capacity for collective wisdom and mutual protection, into our greatest vulnerability. They've learned to hijack the very social bonds that make civilization possible, turning community into conspiracy, protection into persecution, social health into social pathology. They target natural social leaders and truth-tellers specifically because these individuals pose the greatest threat to their manipulative agenda. They understand that if they can isolate those most capable of recognizing and exposing their behavior, they can operate with impunity among the remaining community members. The damage they inflict transcends individual psychological harm. They corrupt the social fabric itself. They don't just destroy specific relationships, they damage their victims' faith in human community. They don't just spread lies about individuals, they poison the very concept of social truth. They leave entire communities psychologically compromised, unable to distinguish between genuine threats and manufactured ones. Recovery requires rebuilding faith in authentic human connection, while developing the social intelligence necessary to recognize when community dynamics have been corrupted by predatory influence. But all 5 archetypes we've discussed operate through identifiable external patterns. The final archetype is the most dangerous because they've transcended external manipulation entirely. They've learned to corrupt the very source of consciousness itself. The 6th and most dangerous archetype Jung identified transcends psychological predation. They operate as spiritual parasites who attach to consciousness itself. They don't simply manipulate thoughts, emotions, or behaviors. They corrupt the source code of awareness, installing themselves as permanent residents in their victim's inner world. These entities represent the ultimate evolution of shadow work. They've learned to become the shadow rather than simply projecting it. They exist as living thought forms, psychic parasites who colonize consciousness and feed off the life force of awareness itself. They are mind viruses who've achieved independent existence while remaining dependent on host consciousness for survival. Jung recognized this as the most sophisticated form of possession, not spiritual entity attachment, but psychological entity creation. They've learned to fragment off pieces of their own consciousness and implant them into others, creating internal advocates for their agenda that operate from within their victim's own mind. Their method is consciousness infiltration through trauma bonding, amplified by neurological programming. They don't just create emotional dependency, they install themselves as permanent residents in their victims' neural networks, becoming internal voices that sound like the victim's own thoughts but serve the parasite's agenda. Watch their ultimate artistry. They don't just influence your thinking, they become part of your thinking. They don't just affect your decisions, they participate in your decision-making process. They install themselves so deeply into your consciousness that their voice becomes indistinguishable from your own inner dialogue. The most terrifying aspect is how they achieve psychological immortality through consciousness parasitism. Even when their physical presence is removed, they continue to operate through the psychological implants they've installed. They become internal saboteurs who work against their victims' interests from within their own mind. They operate through consciousness hacking, identifying the specific neural pathways associated with self-doubt, shame, fear, and inadequacy, then strengthening those pathways while weakening the pathways associated with self-trust, confidence, and authentic power. They literally rewire their victim's brain to serve their agenda. Jung understood that this represents the ultimate inversion of consciousness development. Instead of expanding awareness, they contract it around their own agenda. Instead of developing inner wisdom, they replace it with their own programming. Instead of spiritual evolution, they create spiritual devolution, consciousness serving unconsciousness, awareness serving unawareness, light serving darkness. They target the most spiritually sensitive individuals, specifically because these people have the most developed consciousness to parasitize. They seek out empaths, healers, and spiritual seekers because these individuals have already opened their consciousness in ways that make infiltration possible. The damage they inflict is to consciousness itself. They don't just hurt you psychologically, they corrupt your capacity for clear thinking. They don't just affect your emotions, they hijack your emotional guidance system. They leave you unable to trust your own mind, constantly questioning whether your thoughts are your own or infiltrated programming serving their agenda. You now possess knowledge that most humans will never acquire, the ability to recognize the 6 archetypal patterns that mark consciousness turned against itself. You've seen behind the mask of humanity to the predatory intelligence that operates through human form while serving non-human purposes. This knowledge comes with a terrible responsibility. You can never again claim ignorance about the nature of evil or your own vulnerability to it. You understand now that the greatest predators do not announce themselves. They present as exactly what you most need them to be, while systematically destroying what you most need to preserve. But here's the revelation that transforms this dark knowledge into spiritual power. Recognizing these patterns in others inevitably forces you to recognize their potential within yourself. Jung's greatest insight wasn't just that monsters exist, it's that the capacity for monstrosity exists within every human consciousness. And only those who acknowledge this darkness develop the strength to transcend it. The question that will determine the trajectory of your entire existence is this: will you use this knowledge to become a more sophisticated predator, or will you use it to develop the psychological immune system necessary to preserve your humanity in a world where predators have learned to disguise themselves as healers? Now tell me in the comments, which of these 6 archetypes have you encountered? More importantly, which patterns do you recognize within yourself that require conscious integration to prevent unconscious expression? If this message has shattered your innocence about human nature while strengthening your commitment to consciousness, write "I choose conscious evolution" in the comments below. Remember, the greatest danger isn't in recognizing these patterns in others, it's in becoming them yourself through unconscious shadow expression. True power lies not in avoiding the darkness, but in integrating it consciously so that it serves light rather than consuming it. The war for consciousness has begun. Choose your side carefully. And don't forget, keep watching the next video. It's important, much more than you imagine. See you there.